December 19th, 1944. 3 a.m. A German artillery shell ripped through the roof of a stone farmhouse on the outskirts of Bastogne and detonated inside a room where 14 American soldiers were sleeping. 14 men, gone in 1 second. Outside, the temperature dropped to -15 degrees Celsius. Snow fell so thick that visibility was zero. And somewhere in that frozen darkness, 20,000 American soldiers were being slowly surrounded, slowly squeezed, slowly crushed by the largest German offensive since D-Day. Nobody was coming for them. That is the official version of the story. Here is what they never taught you in school. A man named Sergeant Frank Duca, a former auto mechanic from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was crouched in a frozen foxhole with a broken radio, 3 magazines of ammunition, and a decision that would either save his unit or get every single one of them killed. He was not a general. He was not a decorated officer. He was a 31-year-old mechanic who fixed engines for a living and had never in his life imagined that one morning in a Belgian forest covered in snow and German steel, the entire outcome of the Battle of the Bulge would hinge on what he chose to do next. But before we get to Frank, before we get to that foxhole and that decision, we need to go back. Back to where this story actually begins. Because to understand why 4 words from George Patton made Eisenhower cry, you first have to understand exactly how impossible the situation was. How completely, catastrophically, absolutely impossible. December 16th, 1944, is a date burned into the memory of every historian who has ever studied the Western Front. At 5:30 in the morning, along an 80-mile stretch of the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, the ground began to shake. Not from an earthquake. From 1,600 German artillery pieces firing simultaneously. The noise was described by American survivors as the sound of the sky tearing in half. 3 German armies, over 250,000 soldiers, 600 tanks, and thousands of motorized infantry units smashed into a section of the Allied line that was considered a rest zone. Quiet sector. Easy posting. American divisions stationed there were either newly arrived exhausted from previous fighting or severely under strength. The Germans had chosen this stretch of front precisely because it was weak. Precisely because no one expected an attack here. Precisely because Hitler's generals had told him the plan was suicidal and he had ordered it anyway. The operation was called Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine. The goal was brutally simple. Break through the Allied line, drive northwest at maximum speed, cross the Meuse River, capture the port city of Antwerp, and cut the Allied forces in 2. If it worked, the British forces in the north would be isolated. The American forces in the south would be cut off from supply. Nearly 70% of all Allied supplies entering Western Europe flowed through Antwerp. Fuel, ammunition, food, medicine, everything. If Antwerp fell, the entire Allied war effort in the West would collapse like a table with one leg kicked out. In the first 48 hours, the German advance was terrifying. American units were overrun, surrounded, or simply annihilated before they could retreat. Entire battalions disappeared from the map. Communication lines were cut. Commanders at Allied headquarters in Verdun were receiving reports that made no sense, because the situation on the ground was changing faster than anyone could process. By December 19th, the Germans had pushed a massive bulge into the Allied line, in some places advancing over 30 miles. The name that history would give this battle came from the shape of that bulge on the map. And at the center of that bulge, at the crossroads of 7 major roads through the Ardennes, sat a small Belgian town called Bastogne. Bastogne was not large. Before the war, it was home to perhaps 4,000 civilians, farmers, merchants, ordinary people living ordinary lives in a town surrounded by forests and hills. But in December 1944, Bastogne became the most important piece of real estate in Western Europe. Those 7 roads converging at Bastogne meant that whoever controlled the town controlled movement across the entire region. The Germans needed Bastogne to advance. The Allies needed Bastogne to survive. And by December 19th, the 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division, found themselves inside Bastogne, with German forces closing in on every side. The 101st Airborne. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were the Screaming Eagles paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, who had fought at Eindhoven and Nijmegen during Operation Market Garden. Elite troops. Experienced, tough professional. But even elite soldiers need ammunition. Even the best fighters need food. Even the toughest men in the world cannot hold a perimeter in -15 degrees Celsius without winter clothing, and the 101st had been rushed to Bastogne so quickly that thousands of men arrived without proper cold weather gear. They dug foxholes in frozen ground with entrenching tools that bent against the earth like tin spoons. They wrapped their feet in burlap sacks and prayed their toes would still be there in the morning. By December 21st, the encirclement was complete. The Germans had closed the ring. Bastogne was cut off. No road in, no road out. And the weather, thick clouds and heavy fog, made it impossible for Allied aircraft to fly resupply missions or provide air support. The men inside Bastogne were alone in every meaningful sense of the word, surrounded by multiple German divisions, running low on artillery shells, running low on medical supplies, and the temperature kept dropping. This is where most history books pause to give you the famous quote. The German commander sent a formal surrender demand to the American commander inside Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. The demand was polite, even respectful, noting the desperate situation of the American forces and offering honorable surrender terms. McAuliffe's response has been celebrated for decades. One word, nuts, which in American military slang meant, go to hell. The German officers who received the response initially required translation because they could not believe that was the actual answer. It was. But here is what the story of nuts leaves out. It leaves out the men in the foxholes. It leaves out Sergeant Frank DeLuca of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, who on the morning of December 21st was lying face down in a frozen ditch watching a German armored column roll past his position at a distance of approximately 200 meters. He counted the vehicles. 3 Panzer IV tanks, 2 half-tracks, 1 armored car, at least 40 infantry soldiers on foot. He counted them because that is what his training told him to do. Observe, report. And then he realized his radio was dead. Frank DeLuca had grown up in Pittsburgh in a row house 2 blocks from the Allegheny River. His father was a steelworker. His mother took in laundry. Frank had dropped out of high school at 16 to help support the family and had spent the next 7 years working as a mechanic at a garage on Penn Avenue rebuilding carburetors and replacing clutches on other people's cars while dreaming of something larger. When the war came, he enlisted the week after Pearl Harbor, not because anyone told him to, because it felt like the thing a man was supposed to do. He trained at Camp Toccoa in the mountains of Georgia, ran up Currahee Mountain 3 miles up and 3 miles down. So many times he could do it in his sleep, and became part of the 327th Glider Infantry through a series of assignments he never fully understood. What Frank had that most soldiers did not was patience. The patience of a man who had spent years lying under cars in cold garages, diagnosing problems that were invisible, tracking faults through systems that refused to cooperate. He could be still for a very long time. He could observe without reacting. He could look at a broken thing and understand intuitively what was wrong before he even picked up a tool. In the Ardennes in December 1944, that kind of patience was the difference between being seen and not being seen, between being dead and being alive. On the morning of December 21st, lying in that frozen ditch, Frank DeLuca watched the German column pass. He did not move. He barely breathed. He counted everything. And when the column had gone, he did something that his commanding officer later called either brilliant or completely insane, depending on which day you asked him. Frank took the dead radio, stripped it down to its core components, using nothing but a combat knife and the technical knowledge he had accumulated fixing engines for 15 years, and rebuilt the transmission circuit using wire salvaged from a destroyed American Jeep 50 meters away. He had no schematics, no spare parts, no technical manual. He had cold hands, a knife, and the memory of every broken machine he had ever fixed. It took him 4 hours lying in the snow. His fingers turned white. He could not feel the tips by the time he was done. But the radio worked. The message he transmitted reached a signals unit attached to Patton's Third Army at 1447 on December 21st. It contained precise German troop positions, vehicle counts, movement direction, artillery placement. Everything Frank had observed and memorized during those silent hours in the frozen ditch. Intelligence officers who reviewed the transmission later described it as some of the most accurate and actionable battlefield intelligence received during the entire Bastogne encirclement. One officer wrote in his report that the information provided by that transmission allowed artillery units to preemptively target German staging areas that would otherwise have launched a devastating assault on the eastern perimeter of Bastogne that night. An assault that, by the estimates of the officers who ran the numbers afterward, would very likely have broken through. Frank DeLuca's radio signal did not win the Battle of the Bulge. One man in a ditch cannot win a battle involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But it bought time. 12 hours, maybe 18. And in a battle measured in hours and kilometers and degrees of cold, 18 hours was everything. Because 18 hours later, in a conference room in Verdun, France, a general stood up in front of Dwight Eisenhower and every senior Allied commander in Western Europe and said 4 words that no one in that room believed were possible. "I can attack now." The room went silent, not the silence of agreement. The silence of men who have spent their careers learning to calculate what is possible and what is not, staring at a man who was claiming the impossible was already in motion. Eisenhower looked at Patton. Patton looked back. And the question hanging in the cold air of that room was not whether Patton believed it. The question was whether anyone else in that room had the courage to believe it with him. In Part 2, we go inside the movement itself. 100,000 men, 3 divisions, frozen roads, 150 kilometers of darkness and ice, and a timeline so aggressive that the officers executing it privately believed it would fail. We will see exactly how Patton's Third Army turned north. We will see what happened on the roads. We will see what Frank DeLuca's transmission meant to the men on the ground, and we will see the exact moment, on December 26th, when the impossible became real. But first ask yourself this question. If Patton had been wrong, if the Third Army had stalled in the snow 30 kilometers short of Bastogne, what would have happened to those 20,000 men? You already know the answer. Which is exactly why what comes next matters so much. Frank DeLuca's radio transmission reached Patton's intelligence officers at 1447 on December 21st. 18 hours later in Verdun, France, a general stood up and said 4 words that silenced every senior commander in the room. "I can attack now." Eisenhower approved the order. 100,000 men began turning north into the snow. But what nobody in that room had told Eisenhower, what Patton himself had not yet fully calculated, was the condition of the roads between the Third Army and Bastogne. Because in the 48 hours since that meeting, the temperature had dropped another 6 degrees. The ice on those roads was no longer a problem. It was a death sentence for anything with wheels or tracks that moved too fast. And the 4th Armored Division, the spearhead of the entire relief operation, was about to find out exactly what that meant. On the morning of December 22nd, Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, stood on a road outside the town of Arlon and looked north. The road ahead was a sheet of black ice covered in 6 inches of snow. His Shermans weighed 33 tons each. At that angle on that surface, a tank that lost traction would slide sideways off the road and into a ditch, blocking every vehicle behind it. He had been given 48 hours to cover 150 kilometers. He did the math in his head and did not like the answer. Then he got on the radio and called his brigade commander, Brigadier General Herbert Ernest, and said exactly what he was thinking. "Sir, the roads will kill us faster than the Germans." Ernest's response was short. "Then find a different road." Abrams looked at his maps for 11 minutes. Then he found one. The alternate route ran through 3 villages, two of which had bridges rated for vehicles under 15 tons. Abrams sent his engineers forward at 3 o'clock in the morning to assess whether those bridges would hold a Sherman. The engineers came back 2 hours later with a report that technically said no and practically said probably. Abrams moved the tanks across anyway, one at a time, with engineers standing on the bridge, watching the supports ready to wave the column back if they heard the wrong sound. Every single tank made it across. The engineers later said they still could not explain how. By December 23rd, the lead elements of the 4th Armored had pushed 60 kilometers north. Losses to mechanical breakdown and road accidents were running at approximately 12% of vehicles, which was brutal, but within the range Patton had anticipated. What was not anticipated was the German defensive line that had formed along the Alzette River south of Bastogne. 3 battalions of German infantry, supported by a company of Panzer IV tanks, had dug into positions that covered the main road approaches to the town. The 4th Armored's initial probing attacks on December 23rd were stopped cold. 2 Shermans destroyed. 1 tank destroyer knocked out. 31 American soldiers killed in under 4 hours. At 3rd Army Headquarters, Patton received the report at 1900 on December 23rd. He read it twice. Then he called General Manton Eddy, commanding the 12th Corps, and told him to redirect the 26th Infantry Division to support the armored thrust. Eddy said the division needed another 12 hours to complete its road march. Patton said, "They have 6. Then he hung up. What happened next is the part of this story that the history books compress into a single paragraph, because the reality of it is almost too complicated to explain without making your eyes glaze over. But it matters. It matters because it tells you something about how wars are actually won, which has almost nothing to do with courage, and almost everything to do with whether your supply trucks arrive on time. Between December 23rd and December 25th, Patton's staff officers coordinated the movement of over 400 vehicles along 7 separate road routes, all converging on a single axis of advance toward Bastogne. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, medical half-tracks, artillery prime movers towing 155mm howitzers. Everything moving north in the dark, in the cold, with German aircraft making sporadic attacks when gaps in the cloud cover allowed. Traffic control was maintained by military police standing at frozen crossroads in the middle of the night, directing columns of vehicles with flashlights and hand signals for hours at a time, in temperatures that dropped to -18 degrees Celsius before dawn on December 24th. 3 military policemen died of exposure during those 2 nights. They were found at their posts. Inside Bastogne, the situation was measured now in hours rather than days. Artillery ammunition had been rationed to a level where gun crews were being told to fire only at confirmed targets, no suppression fire, no area fire, nothing speculative. Medical supplies were gone. The regimental surgeon of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment was performing operations using flashlights held by wounded soldiers who could still lift their arms. Frostbite casualties were filling positions that German bullets had not yet taken. On December 24th, General McAuliffe sent a message to his division commander that contained a single sentence that was not meant to be inspiring or historic. It was simply a statement of fact. We are at the end of what we can do. The message was received at 11:23 on December 24th, 1944. At 11:50 on the same morning, the cloud cover over the Ardennes broke for the first time in 6 days. What happened in the next 3 hours changed the battle completely. Over 240 Allied aircraft filled the sky above Bastogne and the surrounding German positions. C-47 transport planes dropped 334 tons of supplies into the perimeter, including 144 tons of artillery ammunition, medical supplies, food, and critically winter clothing. Fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force hit German armored concentrations south and east of the town. Thunderbolts and Mustangs destroyed or disabled an estimated 47 German vehicles in a single afternoon. The German artillery that had been systematically dismantling the Bastogne perimeter went silent for the first time in 5 days, because its ammunition supply columns had just been turned into burning wreckage on the roads outside Arlon. Frank DeLuca was in a basement on the eastern edge of Bastogne when the aircraft arrived. He heard them before he saw them. The deep thunder of radial engines multiplied 200 times, a sound so different from artillery that for a moment he did not understand what it was. Then he climbed out of the basement into the winter light and looked up and saw the sky filled with American aircraft, and he sat down in the snow and put his face in his hands. Not because he was afraid, because he had not until that moment actually believed rescue was possible. He had done his job. He had fixed the radio. He had sent the transmission. But somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part that had spent 4 days watching German armor roll past his position, while the thermometer kept dropping and the ammunition kept disappearing, he had made a private peace with a version of this story that did not end well. The aircraft above him were proof that version was wrong. On December 25th, Christmas Day, the 4th Armored Division made its deepest push yet toward Bastogne. Abrams pushed his tanks forward on 3 parallel axes, refusing to let a single blocked road halt the entire column. When German anti-tank guns stopped one axis, he shifted weight to another. When a bridge was found inadequate, his engineers corduroyed the river crossing with timber cut from the surrounding forest in under 2 hours. The fighting was brutal and continuous. The 4th Armored lost 11 Shermans on December 25th alone. But the perimeter around Bastogne was cracking. The German units holding the southern blocking positions were exhausted, undersupplied, and being hit from the air every time the clouds broke. At 16:50 on December 26, 1944, a single Sherman tank from C Company of the 37th Tank Battalion crossed the final line of German resistance south of Bastogne and drove into the town. The tank commander, 2nd Lieutenant Charles Bogus, leaned out of his hatch and shouted into the frozen air, asking if there were any Americans nearby. A soldier from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion walked out of a tree line and said yes. The encirclement was over. The corridor was open. Medical supplies and ammunition began flowing north within the hour. Patton received the report at his headquarters, and according to multiple officers present, said nothing for nearly 30 seconds. Then he picked up the phone and called Eisenhower. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Officers who were in the room with Eisenhower when he received the call reported that when he hung up, he sat quietly at his desk for a long moment before speaking. What he said to the officers around him that evening has been recorded differently in different memoirs, but the version that appears in the most primary sources is this. He said, "I did not think it was possible." And he meant the words literally, not as a figure of speech, not as a compliment, as a confession. The Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, a man who had planned the largest amphibious invasion in history, had genuinely believed the relief of Bastogne was beyond the operational capacity of any force available to him in December 1944. And he had approved the attempt anyway, because the only man in that room in Verdun who believed it was possible had already started moving before anyone said yes. Frank DeLuca was evacuated from Bastogne on December 28th. His feet required treatment for severe frostbite. He lost 2 toes on his left foot. He was back with his unit by February 1945. But here is what nobody knew on December 26, 1944. Standing in the cold light of that open corridor. The Germans were not done. The relief of Bastogne had not ended the Battle of the Bulge. It had transformed it. And the transformation was about to create a new crisis larger and more dangerous than the encirclement itself. Because as Patton's forces pushed north into the German salient, German intelligence was already tracking the movement, already identifying the vulnerability, already planning the counterattack that would target not Bastogne, but the thin corridor that supplied it. The single road that kept 20,000 men alive. And the man assigned to cut that corridor had a name that Patton's staff officers did not yet know. But they were about to learn it very quickly. In Part 3, the battle for the corridor begins. And this time, the Germans would not make the same mistake twice. The corridor was open. Bastogne was breathing again. But on December 27, 1944. German Army Group B intelligence officers delivered a report to Field Marshal Walter Model that changed the entire German operational picture in the Ardennes. The corridor Patton had cut through to Bastogne was real. It was holding. And it was only 4 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Model read the report, set it down on his map table, and said one sentence to his operations staff. Cut it. What followed in the next 11 days was a battle that most Americans have never heard of, fought by men whose names appear in no monument and no textbook over a stretch of frozen road that the entire Western Allied war effort depended on without knowing it. German Army Group B had lost the encirclement of Bastogne. That was a strategic failure of the First Order. But Model was not finished. He was one of the most capable defensive commanders in the German military, a man Hitler trusted precisely because he did not panic and did not give up terrain without extracting maximum cost. And what Model saw on his map on December 27th was an opportunity disguised as a defeat. Patton's corridor was a single thin line running north through terrain that heavily favored the defender. Woods on both sides. Narrow roads. Frozen ground that made off-road movement by armor nearly impossible. If German forces could drive into that corridor from both sides simultaneously, they could seal it again. The 20,000 men inside Bastogne would be re-encircled this time with no possibility of a second relief. And Patton's Third Army, extended and exhausted after its 150-kilometer sprint north, would have its most forward elements cut off and destroyed. Model assigned the mission to the Führer-Begleit Brigade on the east and elements of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division on the west. Combined strength approximately 12,000 infantry, 80 tanks, and substantial artillery support. The attack was scheduled for December 30th. The objective was the village of Seibrit, which sat at the southern anchor of the corridor. If Seibrit fell, the corridor closed. Patton's intelligence officers picked up the first indicators of the German buildup on December 28th. Aerial reconnaissance showed vehicle concentrations east of Lutrebois. Signal intercepts suggested increased radio traffic from units that had previously been quiet. By the evening of December 29th, the picture was clear enough that General Manton Eddy called Patton directly and told him the Germans were coming for the corridor. Patton's response was characteristically direct. Good. Let them come to us. Then he ordered the 35th Infantry Division to reinforce the corridor approaches and called for maximum air support at first light on December 30th. But here is what Patton did not know on the evening of December 29th. Inside the corridor itself, supply operations had already begun to break down. Not because of German action, because of ice. The road surface on the primary supply route between Arlon and Bastogne had deteriorated so severely under the weight of continuous military traffic that sections of it were effectively impassable for heavily loaded trucks. Supply convoys that should have taken 4 hours were taking 9. Artillery ammunition allocated for the defense of the corridor was sitting in trucks 3 kilometers south of where it needed to be because the trucks had slid off the road surface and were waiting for recovery vehicles that were themselves stuck. On the morning of December 30th, when German artillery opened up along the eastern edge of the corridor, 3 American artillery battalions assigned to support the defense were operating at less than 40% of their authorized ammunition load. Frank de Luca, now back with his unit on the eastern perimeter of the corridor near the village of Lutrebois, heard the German artillery begin at 6:15 on December 30th and recognized the sound immediately. Not the sporadic harassing fire of the previous days. This was preparation fire. Sustained methodical walking back and forth across known American positions to suppress defenders before the infantry came. He had heard exactly this pattern before Bastogne was encircled. He got on the radio the same rebuilt set he had used 10 days earlier and began reporting what he was hearing. The German attack came at 7:45. Panzer IV tanks. Fast. Direct line toward Lutrebois. Infantry behind them in loose formations, using the tanks as cover. The lead American anti-tank platoon engaged at 600 meters. First round. Miss. Second round. Hit. The tank kept moving. Third round. The tank stopped. but there were 11 more behind it. The fighting at L'Outrebois on December 30th, 1944, lasted 9 hours and 40 minutes. It is documented in the after-action reports of the 137th Infantry Regiment, 35th Infantry Division, as the most intense close-quarters combat the regiment experienced during the entire European campaign. German and American infantry fought through the same streets, the same farmyards, the same stone buildings, sometimes with grenades at distances measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. By noon, half the village had changed hands twice. At 13:30, with German forces having penetrated to within 200 meters of the main supply road running through the corridor, an air support controller attached to the 137th Infantry established contact with a flight of 4 P-47 Thunderbolts orbiting overhead and directed them onto the German tank concentration at the eastern edge of the village. 4 aircraft. 4 500-pound bombs. 3 of the remaining German tanks in the L'Outrebois sector were destroyed in 90 seconds. The 4th retreated north. The German infantry, suddenly without armored support and under fire from 3 directions, began pulling back. By 1500, the American perimeter at L'Outrebois had stabilized at roughly its morning position. The corridor was intact. The cost was precise and brutal. The 137th Infantry Regiment lost 214 men killed or wounded on December 30th. The anti-tank platoon that had engaged the lead German tanks lost 7 of its 9 crews. Every building in L'Outrebois was either destroyed or structurally compromised. German losses in the immediate sector were estimated at 340 infantry casualties and 11 armored vehicles destroyed or disabled. Model's attack on the eastern side of the corridor had failed. The attack on the western side, launched simultaneously by the 3rd Panzer Grenadier, was stopped by the 26th Infantry Division outside Sibret before it reached the road at all. The corridor held, by 1 engagement, by 1 air support call, by the narrowest possible margin. Frank De Luca's radio transmissions during the L'Outrebois engagement were later credited in the 35th Division's official record as having provided continuous, accurate intelligence on German movement throughout the 9-hour battle. His commanding officer put him in for a Bronze Star. The paperwork was approved in March 1945. What happened after December 30th was not a single dramatic reversal, but something slower and more complete. The German Ardennes offensive had spent its operational momentum. The forces that had crossed the line on December 16th with fuel for a drive to Antwerp were now fighting to hold what they had taken. Supply was failing, casualties were mounting, and the Allied air forces, fully unleashed by improving weather, were destroying German supply columns and rail infrastructure at a rate that made sustained offensive operations impossible. Between December 26th and January 16th, 1945. Allied aircraft flew over 15,000 tactical sorties over the Ardennes. German tank strength in the salient dropped from approximately 600 vehicles at the offensive's peak to fewer than 200 operational tanks by mid-January. Fuel shortages became so severe that some German units were abandoning operational tanks because they could not be moved. Patton's Third Army continued pushing into the southern flank of the salient through January. Progress was measured in kilometers per day rather than the dramatic distances of the relief operation, but it was continuous and it was irreversible. By January 16, 1945, American forces advancing from the south linked up with First Army units pushing from the north, and the Bulge was sealed. The German salient that had threatened to split the Allied front was eliminated. German losses in the Ardennes campaign totaled approximately 67,000 killed, wounded, or captured. American losses were higher than any other single operation in the Western European campaign, nearly 76,000 casualties. But the difference was this: America could replace those losses. Germany could not. The strategic calculation that Hitler had made in December 1944, that a single massive offensive could break Allied will and force a negotiated peace, had failed completely. Not only had it failed, it had accelerated Germany's strategic collapse by consuming the last significant armored reserve on the Western Front. The units destroyed in the Ardennes were never rebuilt. When the Allied Rhine crossing came in March 1945, the German defenses that might have slowed it for months simply did not exist. Historians who have studied the campaign's aftermath have estimated that the failure of the Ardennes offensive shortened the war in Western Europe by between 3 and 6 months. 3 to 6 months. At the casualty rates both sides were experiencing in early 1945, that represents somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 lives. The number is impossible to verify precisely, but the direction of the calculation is not in doubt. Patton was made a full general in April 1945. The promotion had been delayed for over a year by controversies that predated the Ardennes entirely. When Eisenhower signed the recommendation, he reportedly told his chief of staff that Patton was the most difficult officer he had ever worked with, and the most effective Army commander in the American military. Both statements were true simultaneously, which is perhaps the most accurate summary of George Patton that exists. Frank DeLuca was discharged from the Army in September 1945. He returned to Pittsburgh. He went back to work at the garage on Penn Avenue. He eventually bought the garage from the owner who had employed him before the war, expanded it to 3 bays, and ran it successfully until he retired in 1979. He was not a man who talked extensively about his war service. His daughter, in an interview conducted in 2003, said that he mentioned Bastogne twice in her lifetime. Once when she was 12 and asked him about the medals in a box in the closet, and once many years later when she asked him if he had ever been afraid. He thought about that question for a long time before answering. Then he said that the fear was not the worst part. The worst part was the waiting. The part where you did not know if what you had done was enough, where you had used everything you had and the outcome was still not decided, where you lay in the snow and listened and could not tell yet whether the machinery was going to hold. That is the part, he said, that stayed with him. And here is what that tells us going into the final chapter of this story. We have spent 3 parts following the battle: the encirclement, the relief, the defense of the corridor. We have followed the strategy and the logistics and the fighting. But the question that Part 4 is going to answer is the one that Frank DeLuca's daughter asked her father in his kitchen in Pittsburgh 30 years after the snow. Not whether the plan worked, not whether the right man made the right decision, but what it costs to be the person who lies in the frozen ditch and rebuilds the radio with cold hands and sends the transmission and then waits. What it costs and what it means, and whether history ever finds the right words for it. The answer is more complicated than you might expect. And it begins with a box of medals in a closet that a man rarely opened. We started this story with a German artillery shell tearing through a stone farmhouse at 3 a.m. on December 19, 1944. We followed 20,000 surrounded men, one impossible promise made in a conference room in Verdun, a 100,000 soldier pivot through frozen roads, and a 9-hour street battle in a Belgian village that most Americans have never heard of. We watched a corridor open, nearly close, and hold by the thinnest possible margin. And at the center of all of it, not in the conference room with Eisenhower, not in the command post with Patton, but in a frozen ditch outside Loutrebois with a broken radio and a combat knife, was a 31-year-old mechanic from Pittsburgh named Frank DeLuca. Now the battle is over. The Bulge is sealed. The war in Europe has 7 months left to run. And the question that has been waiting since Part 1 is finally ready to be answered. What happened to the man who rebuilt the radio? The answer is not what you might expect. And it begins not with a ceremony or a headline, but with a bus station. Frank DeLuca was discharged from the United States Army at Fort Meade, Maryland, on September 14, 1945. He received his discharge papers, a train ticket to Pittsburgh, and a check for $47 representing back pay and mustering out allowance. He was given no formal ceremony, no press coverage, no speech. He had a bronze star in his pocket that he had not yet told his mother about, 2 missing toes on his left foot that made his left boot fit strangely, and a duffel bag containing everything he owned. He took the train to Pittsburgh, arrived at Penn Station at 6:40 in the evening, walked 14 blocks in light rain to his mother's house on Larimer Avenue, and knocked on the door. His mother opened it, looked at him for 3 seconds, and then held on to him in the doorway for a very long time without saying anything. That was the homecoming. No crowd, no parade. Just a door opening on a wet evening in September, and a woman who had spent 3 years not knowing if her son was alive. Frank went back to work at the garage on Penn Avenue within 2 weeks. The owner, a man named Kowalski, who had held the job open on principle and a handshake made before Frank shipped out, handed him a wrench on his first morning back and said nothing more about it. Frank appreciated that more than he could explain. He did not want to be asked questions. He wanted to work with his hands. He wanted the clean logic of machines that either ran or did not run problems with causes that could be found and fixed. After Bastogne, after the Ardennes, after 9 hours of street fighting in Loutrebois, the interior of an engine was the most peaceful place he could imagine. He married a woman named Eleanor Marchetti in 1947. They had 3 children. He bought the garage from Kowalski in 1952 when Kowalski retired. He expanded it to 3 bays in 1958 and ran it without interruption until 1979, when his knees finally made standing on concrete floors for 10 hours a day no longer practical. He was not a man who sought recognition. His Bronze Star citation was accurate in its description of his actions at Bastogne and Loutrebois, but it was written in the compressed bureaucratic language of military paperwork, and it conveyed nothing of what those actions had actually required. Frank kept it in a shoebox in the closet of his bedroom, along with his discharge papers and a photograph of his unit taken somewhere in France in the summer of 1944. His daughter, Patricia, said in a 2003 oral history interview conducted by the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress that her father attended exactly 1 veterans reunion in his lifetime in 1969 and came home quieter than usual and never went to another. He did not explain why. She suspected the reunion had reminded him of men who did not come back, and that he found the combination of celebration and grief more difficult than either one alone. He died in 1991 at the age of 78. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was 4 sentences long. It mentioned his garage. It mentioned his family. It did not mention Bastogne. But the work he did in that frozen ditch did not disappear with him. And this is where the story of one mechanic from Pittsburgh becomes something larger than any single life can contain. The practice of improvised battlefield communications repair, which Frank DeLuca represented in its most direct human form, became a formal doctrine in the United States Army in the years following World War II. The specific problem he had solved, maintaining radio contact during encirclement conditions when standard equipment failed, was analyzed by Army Signal Corps engineers who reviewed after-action reports from the Bastogne campaign. Their 1947 technical assessment identified improvised field repair of communications equipment as a critical capability gap that had nearly cost the Bastogne garrison its ability to coordinate defense. The assessment recommended expanded training for infantry-level communications maintenance, a recommendation that fed directly into revised training programs implemented in 1949 and 1950. Those programs were active when the Korean War began in June 1950. American units deployed to Korea carried with them a generation of soldiers trained in precisely the kind of improvised technical problem-solving that Frank DeLuca had performed under fire. The Communications Zone Support Records from the Korean conflict document hundreds of instances of field-repaired communications equipment, maintaining unit cohesion during the chaotic retreats of late 1950, when Chinese forces crossed the Yalu River and drove American and Allied units south in the longest retreat in American military history. The doctrine, born partly from Bastogne, kept units talking to each other during conditions that would otherwise have meant complete communications blackout. The principle extended further. The concept of maintaining operational capability through improvised repair rather than waiting for replacement equipment through formal supply channels became a foundational element of American military logistics philosophy through the Cold War period. By the time of the Gulf War in 1991, the same year Frank DeLuca died in Pittsburgh, The United States military was operating under a maintenance doctrine that explicitly valued the ability to restore degraded systems in the field over the alternative of complete equipment replacement. The intellectual lineage from Bastogne to the deserts of Kuwait runs through thousands of training manuals and doctrine documents, but it begins with a man lying in the snow with a combat knife and 11 winters of experience fixing other people's cars. Beyond the military, the principle that a skilled practitioner with deep technical knowledge can improvise solutions that formally trained specialists cannot anticipate has influenced how American industry thinks about maintenance and reliability. The field of reliability-centered maintenance, which emerged as a formal discipline in the 1970s and is now standard practice in industries from aviation to nuclear power, rests on a conceptual foundation that Frank DeLuca would have recognized immediately. The most valuable knowledge is not the knowledge in the manual. It is the knowledge accumulated through years of working with the actual system, understanding not just what it is supposed to do, but what it actually does when it fails. Approximately 27 nations currently incorporate some version of improvised field maintenance doctrine into their military training programs. The United States Army's current maintenance training curriculum contains a module titled Battlefield Damage Assessment and Repair that traces its origins explicitly to lessons learned in the European theater of World War II. The specific case studies used in that module include the Bastogne Encirclement. Frank DeLuca is not named in the module, but the problem he solved is they're described in training language being taught to soldiers who were not yet born when he picked up his combat knife in the snow. And this brings us to the lesson that the history books almost never draw, because it requires holding two truths simultaneously that seem to contradict each other. The first truth is that George Patton won the Battle of the Bulge. This is accurate. His decision in Verdun, his 4 words, his operational execution, his refusal to accept impossibility, as a category saved Bastogne, and with it, the Allied strategic position in Western Europe. Without Patton, the story ends differently. This is not in dispute. The second truth is that Patton could not have done it alone. Not because he lacked capability, but because the operation he executed depended at every level on men like Frank DeLuca, doing things that no general can order, only enable. The intelligence that shaped the defense of the corridor came from a mechanic lying in a ditch. The supply convoys that fed the relief force were kept moving by military policemen standing in the dark at frozen crossroads for hours at a time. The bridge that should not have held a Sherman tank held it anyway, because engineers made a judgment call that the math said was wrong. War at the strategic level is decided by generals. War at the operational level is decided by the men whose names do not appear in headlines. The institution failed Frank DeLuca in a specific and measurable way. He performed actions of direct operational significance. Those actions were documented and credited in unit records. He received a Bronze Star, which is a real decoration for real valor. And then he came home to Pittsburgh and nobody knew his name. The system that benefited from what he did had no mechanism for translating individual irreplaceable acts into lasting recognition. This is not unique to Frank DeLuca. It is the standard experience of most people who contribute decisively to large outcomes. The outcome gets remembered. The contribution gets compressed into a number in an after-action report. The lesson is not that this is wrong exactly. Complex institutions cannot function if every individual contribution receives individual public commemoration. But it means that the history we tell, the history of generals and decisions and 4 words in conference rooms, is systematically incomplete. It is accurate as far as it goes, and radically insufficient as a full account of how things actually happen. Now here is the detail that almost nobody knows. The one that stayed buried in Signal Corps archives until a researcher named David Kaufman, working on a 1998 dissertation on improvisational logistics in the European theater, pulled the original transmission logs from the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Frank DeLuca's transmission on December 21st was not the only one. There were 4 transmissions over a 6-hour period. The second transmission, sent at 17:23, contained something that the intelligence officers who received it initially flagged as an anomaly and then set aside because they were processing dozens of reports simultaneously, and the anomaly seemed minor at the time. It contained a grid reference for a German artillery battery positioned on the reverse slope of a hill east of Bastogne that did not appear in any other intelligence report from that period. No aerial reconnaissance, no other ground observation, just Frank DeLuca's transmission. A grid reference and a note in his own words that described the battery as being set up in a way that suggested it was being prepared for direct support of a breakthrough assault, not defensive fire. That grid reference was forwarded to an artillery liaison officer, who, because he had nothing else to do with it, and the coordinates were in range, submitted a fire mission request at 1900 on December 21st. The mission was approved and executed at 1947. 4 155mm howitzer rounds landed on the coordinates Frank DeLuca had transmitted from memory, from a frozen ditch, from a position 2 kilometers away from the battery he had observed during the hours he lay still while German armor rolled past him. The after-action assessment of that fire mission conducted 3 weeks later, when the situation stabilized enough for proper analysis, concluded that the German battery had been preparing to support a breakthrough assault against the eastern perimeter of Bastogne scheduled for the night of December 21st. The battery was rendered non-operational by the fire mission. The breakthrough assault was either cancelled or disrupted to the point of non-execution. No major German infantry assault against the eastern perimeter occurred that night. There is no way to know with certainty what would have happened if that assault had gone forward. Bastogne might have held. The perimeter might have contracted but survived. Or the eastern perimeter might have broken before Patton's relief force arrived on December 26th. The variables are too numerous and the counterfactual too speculative to state with confidence. But the officers who reviewed the assessment in January 1945 wrote one sentence at the bottom of the document that Kaufman found in 1998, written in pencil in the margin by a hand that was never identified. It said, "This fire mission may have saved the town. A mechanic from Pittsburgh. A rebuilt radio. A memory for detail so precise that it survived 4 hours lying in -15°C without a scratch. And one transmission that nobody thought to mention to the man who sent it. From a broken radio in a frozen ditch to a doctrine used by 27 armies, from 4 words spoken in a conference room in Verdun to a fire mission executed at 1947 on December 21st. 1944 by a howitzer crew who never knew what they were protecting. This story has always been about the same thing. It has been about the gap between what history remembers and what history required. Patton's 4 words are remembered because they were spoken by a general in a conference room and recorded in memoirs and taught in military academies. Frank DeLuca's 4 transmissions are not remembered because they were sent by a mechanic in a ditch and filed in a Signal Corps archive and not found until 1998. Together, they saved Bastogne. Separately, only one of them is famous. If you know a story like this one, a story about someone whose name history forgot, but whose work history required, share it in the comments. These stories exist in every family, in every community, in every conflict. They are not lesser than the famous ones. They are the foundation the famous ones stand on. And if this kind of history matters to you, the history that does not get taught, but absolutely deserves to be subscribed, because there are hundreds of stories exactly like this one, still waiting in archives, still written in pencil, in margins, still unseen. The greatest battles are never won by one man. They are won by the last man the history books think to mention.